Thank you so much for coming. I have a loud voice, so I'm going to try to keep this mic at a respectful distance. I'm Steve Barry. I'm an economics professor at Yale, and today I am in particular happy to say that I'm faculty director of the Tobin Center for Economic Policy at Yale. We're a center that seeks to promote careful, typically data-driven, nonpartisan research, and when it is ripe for action by people outside of academia to make sure that that research does not get trapped inside of the university, but actually makes its way out to the world. One of our slogans is trying to shorten the time between research and impact. And we have a great staff that works with us with a lot of experience in doing this. My experience is that academics are not very good at that work. And so we should actually have people who work beside us who are actually good at it. We have a couple of our staff members in the back, Michelle and Nick, who helped set this up, and I really appreciate that. And also thanks to the Yale Climate Week folks and Yale Planetary Solutions folks for helping to arrange this and have this great conversation today. So we have a couple fantastic guests with us here today. We're going to talk about agriculture and land use and deforestation and biofuels. And if we don't have a lot of time, but we may touch on a lot of other topics as time goes on. Oh, good. Yeah, I have mine with me too. Right. So yeah. So like a late night host style, we should hold up the book for the camera, right? I think. Is that the way the pros do it? I don't know. Anyway, it's a great book, so I'll give a little introduction, and as you go on, if you want to add some more details, please feel free. So Mike Grunwald is an author, a book writer, a journalist, a columnist. He is the author, I hope I get this right, The Swamp, and also The New Deal. He's a contributing editorialist for the New York Times. In my view, what distinguishes him from many other people who say contribute an editorial to the New York Times is that he's just a fantastic long-term, in-depth reporter who actually just isn't, forming an opinion on something, who's spending many years, deeply immersing himself in a topic. And then, again, the skill that academics don't have of bringing that story to life with interesting characters, interesting arcs of what is going right and wrong in the world. All of his books are a gripping read, and I really suggest them to you. One of the interesting characters in his book is my friend Tim Searchinger. Tim, we should brag at Yale. He's a graduate of the Yale Law School, who, despite the rivalry between the lawyers and the economists at Yale, I have to say many of them are excellent public advocates. And it's almost a little irritating, but there it is. They actually turn out to be really good at it. And Tim and I met many years ago, back when actually both of you, I think, were more focused on water than land, but there are many scarce resources in the world to worry about it. Tim started off as an advocate and a litigator, and I can tell a story, a version of your career. It is that Tim became increasingly concerned that a lot of policy was based on bad evidence, whether that evidence was misinterpreted science, misinterpreted economics, misinterpreted agronomy, or a failure to put all of those things together at one time. So he gradually shifted from being primarily an advocate, occasional litigator, to being someone who gathered many experts together, learned from many different fields. He's written a number of tremendously influential articles, including, and this is pretty unusual for a lawyer, tremendously influential couple of articles in Science about land use change and biofuels, which really set off an entire question in the environmental community. Many conferences around the world trying to figure out the answers to the questions that Tim posed. So what we thought we'd do for a while is, just maybe have a little conversation up here, and then we have some folks in the audience, and we'll try to leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end for people to ask questions, any kind of question you want to ask, any kind of reactions you have. Mike, you want to just start with how you got involved with writing the book that we held up, and sort of what are some of the just very broad themes?
Sure. So I've been writing about public policy, I guess, for 30 years. The environment for 20, though not full time. Actually, my first book is about the Florida Everglades, and the guy who first gave me the tip about how messed up the largest environmental restoration in the history of the planet was is actually sitting right next to me. So I've known Tim for quite a while, and I actually tell the story of in the introduction of how Tim then again inadvertently gave me the tip that led to this book when I was fact checking a story I'd written about my own green life. How I'd gotten a all electric Chevy Bolt, I had solar panels on my roof, and I had this line to sort of illustrate that I wasn't some kind of eco saint. You know, I still line dry. I don't line dry my laundry. I don't unplug my computers at night. I still eat meat. The idea was that clean energy had become, cheap enough to go mainstream. But then I realized, like, I didn't even know if eating meat was bad for the climate and the environment. And I knew Tim was working on agriculture and climate, and so I called him and said, "Is meat really that bad for the environment?" And he said, "Yes." And then he said, "Duh." So I guess maybe some of you know Tim. And that was really the beginning of the journey. I mean, to answer the question about the idea of the book, I mean, we kind of know when you take a cross-country flight, and those of us who live in cities, like you look out and you see all the rectangles and circles, and you're like, wow, there's a lot of agriculture out there. Turns out there is a lot of agriculture out there. Agriculture is really, in many ways, our biggest environmental problem. It's, it uses 70% of our fresh water, so we are drinking the earth too. It's the leading cause of water pollution, right? The dead zone the size of Connecticut and the Gulf of Mexico. It's the leading driver of deforestation, wetland destruction, biodiversity loss. But the main story is that it is eating the earth. It is taking over. Cities and suburbs are now about 1% of the Earth's land, maybe heading towards 2% by 2050. Farms and pastures are almost 40%. And we're on track to deforest another dozen California's worth of land by 2050. And so that is also a huge climate problem. The food system is now about a third of our climate problem. And I always say that trying to decarbonize the planet while you're continuing to cut down trees for agriculture, it's like trying to clean your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. You're making a huge mess because forests store a ton of carbon, but you're also crippling your ability to clean up the mess because forests absorb the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And right now we are tearing down a soccer field worth of tropical forest for agriculture every 6 seconds. So that's really what the book is about. It's sort of a very simple idea, but it's about this sort of massive problem we have, the really bad trajectory we're on. So far we are not really making much of an effort to fix it, but then the second half of the book is sort of looks at how we might.
Yeah, excellent, thanks. A lot of Mike's interviews so far have focused, as is quite natural, on the food we eat, particularly on beef and what to do about beef. But Tim and I have thought about another agricultural issue, which is very heavily featured in the beginning of the book as well, which is the issue of biofuels, or the idea of taking food and turning it into fuel. So Tim, do you want to give us a little background on biofuels, sort of, what's their idea and why did you become so interested in them?
Yeah, so biofuels, as you probably all know, are basically any fuel that is made from plant material. And the main biofuels today are ethanol that comes from corn, wheat, sugarcane, and biodiesel that comes from vegetable oil. And and it's potentially a lot. I mean, it already is a lot. So we have expanded oil seeds, which are the plants, the various types of plants that produce vegetable oil. They have expanded by 240 million acres in 20 years since we started doing biofuels. To give you an idea, that's like a eighth of the continental U.S. And they're mainly expanding into tropical forests. 40% of that has been for the growth of biodiesel. And there's now proposals to have aviation based on biofuels. The cheapest and easiest aviation fuel is also from vegetable oil. To produce 25% of aviation fuel in 2050 from biofuels, from biodiesel, would require 40% of the world's cropland. So you're talking about changes that are reshaping the earth and have the potential to dramatically expand all of these land use problems, the we are eating the earth problem. And the question that I got into is, why do people think that's good for the climate? And so maybe I'll stop there, but we can kind of get back into that, because that's the central premise of the book, is that that is based fundamentally on an accounting error, and it's an accounting error that treats land as free. So if, and most people have no problem with this concept, which is, if we are emitting huge amounts of carbon by clearing forests and expanding agriculture, if virtually all climate solutions, all pathways to a stable climate, assume not only that we have stopped doing that, but that we actually are reforesting substantial amounts of land between now and 2050, even as we are still clearing an area the size of England every year. If that's the case, obviously part of the solution is to use less agricultural land. Biofuels are all about using more agricultural land. So you then have to ask the question, why do people think that's a good idea? And maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah, no, we should. So I was just remembering on the way in and on the train today that when we first started talking about this, you told me about this wonderful renewable energy circle, right? So Tim would say, they would say you take some corn and you turn it into some kind of biofuel. Of course, that takes energy, so now you're in the hole. And then you burn it out of your tailpipe or your jet engine or whatever it's in, and I guess that releases about as much carbon as fossil fuels would. So you're still in the hole. You haven't gained anything back. But the magic of the circle was that as the corn regrew, it would reabsorb much of the carbon that had been released from the tailpipe, and therefore it seemed to these folks early on, right, that you only had to compare the energy used to create the fuel with the carbon uptick as it regrew. And I think the brilliance of Tim's simple question was to ask, you said start with some corn. Yeah, start with some corn. And Tim asked, what corn? What corn? Because before ethanol, all corn, soy, et cetera, that's grown in human agriculture is going directly to humans or indirectly through animals, right? So what corn? And my understanding is the first answer was, well, we'll grow more corn. And Tim said, on what land? And they said in return, no, never mind. Did we say that? We didn't mean to say that. We said that yields would increase so tremendously that we would grow that corn on the same land. And I think Tim said, on what evidence? Particularly in this world where deforestation is happening so much, and where we see a frontier where, particularly, I guess, these oil seeds like soy and palm are hitting right up against tropical forests.
So yeah, and just to expand, another way of thinking about that is the theory, of course, behind biofuels, as Steve just said, is they're not taking carbon out of the ground and putting it in the air. You start by taking carbon in the air, putting it into the corn, and then releasing it. So it's a circle. You're just recycling carbon. And you could say that, but it takes land to do that. What's the cost of using land? Any land that you use to do that is land that could be storing carbon. And in a world where we're already massively expanding agricultural land, we already massively need increases in yield just to meet rising demands for food, that is going to mean we're going to store less carbon. And when you did the very basic calculation, you realized that the amount of carbon that you lose on average to produce the corn that goes into ethanol, after accounting for various byproducts, is about twice as much carbon as you save from fossil fuels over a 30-year period. So if we care about climate change over a 30-year period. So it simply was treating land as free. And so a major focus of Mike's book is that land is not free. And that's really the issue. Is land free from a climate perspective, or is it not free?
I say that I did an event in Miami, and a folk singer had a local folk singer named Grant Livingston had read my book and written a folk song about it. That this had never happened to me before, but it was called "Land Is Not Free." The chorus was like, land is not free. Land is not free. Every acre is sacred. Land is not free. And I was like, that's it. That's the book. That's
And you can all leave now.
yeah, exactly. That's basically right. No, I think Tim. These are very Tim's a very smart guy, but he has these very simple insights. And one of them is like, as Steve suggested, that this whole miracle of the corn that you're growing for fuel, sucking this carbon out of the air. It was already doing that when it was growing food. And then the other main way of looking at it is if you use farmland for fuel, then you are going to need more farmland somewhere else to replace the food. And it's probably not going to be in a parking lot. It's going to be in a forest or a wetland. And that sounds like incredibly obvious. But I have, a chapter of people coming up with, people from basically, but not just like industry people, also scientist people who are just, trying to validate their own priors, coming up with increasingly bizarre whack-a-mole arguments to try to make those really simple facts untrue. And there are all kinds of sort of wishful thinking and just, logical errors and factual errors and, political thumbs on the scale, and which makes, for a chapter about the life cycle analysis of indirect land use change, I mean, it's kind of funny. But really it comes down to these, sort of pretty simple notion that that land has a cost, it has an opportunity cost, and if you use it to grow corn for fuel, it turns out that land is really good at storing carbon and really good at making food, but it kind of sucks at growing energy. And an acre of solar panels produces about 100 times as much energy as an acre of corn grown for ethanol. And Tim's photosynthesis turns out to be in many ways not that efficient. Tim's line is that it was invented 3 billion years ago by blue-green algae, and they're not that smart. Which is maybe a little unfair to photosynthesis. It's kept us alive for the last all life on Earth for the last few billion years. Done a pretty good job of that, but it really does have a lot of inefficiencies. Later in the book, when I'm talking more about the agriculture stuff, there are scientists at the University of Illinois who are using artificial intelligence and modern gene editing and big data to literally engineer the inefficiencies out of photosynthesis. So, it's really a kind of simple story that a very large, influential political industry has tried to make into a complicated story.
So, yeah, I want to talk about, we're saying that this is a very simple story, anyone could understand this story, and nonetheless, right, the state of California requires huge amounts of biodiesel to be used. And maybe we can break it into two parts as to why that's true. One is politics, which I'm not very good at. Another is maybe a little bit of science. Okay, I'm also not good at that. But something else is the use of economic models, right? So, Tim, do you want to tell us, how does the state of California justify what it's doing in the face of your arguments, which you've been making them to their face for many years?
Yeah. So the short answer is you come up with a model that says if land isn't free, it's really, really cheap. And how do you do that? You basically say, well, look, if we divert food, if we divert vegetable oil or corn already being produced to biofuels, how much land will you have to clear to replace it? And you can come up with an economic model that claims not much. And why not? So there are three things that can happen. Now, Steve and I have just written a paper, and I think you can see a little flyer, about specifically the model that California uses. So what could actually happen in the model, and then what would be the basis for that? Well, one thing that can happen is just really crazy stuff happens. Like things happen with no explanation, whatever. Turns out in the California model, when we looked at it, the economics actually predicted massive amounts of land use change that were mathematically impossible given the amount of land that became corn. So it was literally a 1,000-fold mathematical inconsistency, and then they simply divided by 10 in order to get back to the physical reality. So imagine you had a model that said, well, I'm going to predict how many Olympic medals every country will win, and it predicts the number of medals that are 10 times the amount of Olympic medals that actually exist, and then you divide by 10 and say, rely on my model. So that's one thing that happens. You literally have gross mathematical inconsistencies. Another thing that their model says is half the food isn't replaced. So actually, wow, half the food isn't replaced. That's great. What happens if you don't replace half the food? Half the people don't eat. Does anyone know why that would produce greenhouse gas reductions? Does anyone know what happens to the carbon in food that you eat? You breathe it out. So this whole room is a nothing but polluters breathing out the carbon dioxide. And if you eat less, if you eat half, you will breathe out less pollution. Now, it turns out that some of that probably does happen a little bit in the short term, although in this case, the model simply, for the economists, it simply sets the demand elasticities equal to the supply elasticities by arbitrary assumption, so that basically half of the food isn't replaced. And then the last thing is they make it impossible to, in a variety of ways, they make it impossible to clear land. You have rules that basically say, well, if you increase demand for food, just yields automatically go up, pasture yields go up. And above all, and maybe Steve, you can talk about this, they have rules that basically make it impossible to transmit demand from the US or Europe to where land use change is happening. So in other words, all of these things work through prices. You increase demand for crops, and that increases the price, and someone has to supply it. So where do we have land use change in the world today? It's in the tropics. Why? That's where you have a lot of land to clear now for agriculture. But if you set your model so that the prices only go up in the US and don't go up in Brazil, lo and behold, you don't have land use change in Brazil. And that is done through completely arbitrary rules, and we know that's not true. And Steve can actually talk about that. So basically, it's a whole series of things that go on in the model. And a fair amount of the challenge, I mean, the insight that I had is very much a duh. You know, it's embarrassing to kind of create an academic record based on an insight as obvious as that. The hard work is actually going through these models and trying to figure out when people are saying that white is black, to try to figure out why they're actually saying white is black.
Yeah, so what Tim was referencing is that we do have some cards at the back that have a link to our critique of the GTAP model. I think they're going to fly off the shelves. It's not quite as gripping as Mike's book. But it is surprising. I mean, it really is surprising. And we've put a lot of work into describing exactly what goes wrong in these models, including this, there's just a literal part of the code. You always say they divide by 10. It's worse than that. They arbitrarily divide some things by 15 and other things not at all. But, and I've also tried to focus more recently on just what is the direct empirical evidence for what's happening. Not sort of what's going wrong in the model, but what's our high quality evidence that in particular is trying to distinguish cause and effect, isn't just sort of assuming the correlations mean something. And I think there are really three important pathways. One is everyone agrees that when we demand huge amounts of food for fuel in the US, that US prices for agricultural commodities go up. Everyone agrees with that. Indeed, it doesn't work otherwise because you can't get these demand reduction effects. You can't get a yield effect.
The whole point.
The whole point, right. So people don't like to admit this. The whole point of biofuels policy is to drive up the price of these commodities. All the mechanisms work through that, right? And then the question is, what do that price now is it changing the return to agriculture, right? And the question is, what is that doing to yields and what is that doing to land use? So one of the things they say is aggregate agricultural land use in the US has not gone up very much, which I think is roughly true, right? Even though specific crops have changed a lot. But as Tim said, the next step in the causal chain is that there are giant companies, Archer, Daniels, Midland, Cargill, who one of their businesses is to arbitrage any price difference between Rotterdam and Rio and the Chicago Board of Trade. They physically transport the grain if necessary from one place to the other to bring those prices back into equality, because that's how arbitrageurs make money. You buy high, sell low. Sorry, buy low, sell high.
That's why he's an academic,
That's why
not a businessman.
I'm a professor.
Yeah.
That's why I'm a professor. Everything's correct up to sign. And so there's immense evidence that these prices are transmitted. Maybe not to the interior of the less developed world, but certainly across these major agricultural producing regions. And then I've had students and others who've done really careful work about what happens to deforestation when you change the returns to agriculture. So I have a student who, for example, looked at what happens after you build roads in the Amazon, which makes it much more profitable to farm now, to get things in and to get things out. And it leads to massive deforestation. So we know that this policy is increasing prices. We know that those prices are transmitted globally, and we know that those higher prices increase the incentive for deforestation. And we know that the deforestation is happening, again, not in the United States, but worse, I think, probably, on these tropical regions. In Indonesia, in Brazil, and elsewhere.
Just one more thing. One of the amazing things is, and this wouldn't have to happen, there's almost a perfect correlation between U.S. net imports and biofuels, particularly in biodiesel. So what net imports, like how much trade we have. We used to be big sellers of vegetable oil to the world, and now we are importers of vegetable oil, precisely by the amount of vegetable oil we use for biodiesel in the U.S.
Right, so it's a big trade story. And so, okay, so that sounds convincing to me too, and we think we've absolutely devastated this model. But by the way, this never happens to economists. The Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, would say to farmers, even as we speak, the economic modelers are making the adjustments that will get you your subsidy, right? And he actually called the model out by name. The GREET model, as we speak, is being, nobody calls out my models, when they're, no cabinet secretary has ever referenced one of my papers. Okay, Mike, maybe you could talk a little bit about, okay, so Tim and I are convinced, we think we've convinced some other people. The world is a hard place, I guess, right?
This is exactly where I was going to jump in. And I was going to say that I was sort of like for the non-economists in the room, but I actually realized even more for the economists in the room. You should go look at the GTAP study, because they absolutely demolish it. And there's like a hilarious, I thought it was hilarious. There's an interchange between Tim and the guy who sort of developed the GTAP model, where they have this sort of back and forth, where Tim points out that that he had come up with some random number, like with absolutely no evidence, and the guy says, "Oh, you're right. Okay, I'm going to cut the number in half." And he's like, well, no, but it's still like completely no evidence. The number should be 0. And he's like, well, no, but I mean, look, this fertilizer says X. And Tim goes and looks up the fertilizer study, and it's like, no, it doesn't say that at all. And he's like, yeah, but I think my number's still right. And he's like, well, why are you saying that? He's like, well, have you seen what's happening with, the price of corn in Brazil right now? And he's like, looks, and he's like, nothing's happening with the price of corn in Brazil right now. It's really, and so, I don't know, these guys, they're providing facts and evidence and economics and science. There's this thing it's called on the internet Brandolini's law. Have you heard of this? The bullshit asymmetry principle. And it's basically that the energy required to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude larger than the energy required to produce bullshit. And then thinking of it, and so, these guys are great bullshit refuters, but the bullshit persists, and it's partly because, this this book took 5 frickin' years. And you know, one of the themes, and actually I use biofuels, part of the reason that I spend so much time on biofuels, because I should say, like, a spoiler alert, biofuels are eating about a Texas worth of the earth. Livestock are eating 50 Texases worth of the earth, and agriculture is eating 75 Texases worth of the earth. So it's not a biofuel story, but part of the reason that I tell the biofuel story is to, you know, basically establish Tim partly as a bullshit refuter, and this notion that you know, that earth eating is a problem that is that there is just incredible resistance to solving. And when there is resistance, look, I took 5 years, but if you imagine a reporter who's writing about, you know, the California, you know, low carbon fuel standard, which for starters, like, who could be against a low carbon fuel standard? We don't want a high carbon fuel standard, right? You know, who could be against biofuels? We don't want fossil fuels. This stuff all sounds good. And then if you were actually gonna, you know, it's like, oh, there's actually people who say it's bad. And it's like, oh, yes, well, I've refuted the model, and, you know, they divided by 10, and, you know, and you've heard all of this, and, you know, and then there's a trade component, and there's a this component, whatever. He says it's good. She says it's bad. I mean, actually, it's almost always he. And it just makes it very difficult. And as long as there's uncertainty, right, on these things, then it kind of reverts to the politics. And I tell some, you know, kind of, I thought, harrowing stories, but in a way it's kind of funny, of like the guy who was in charge of the low carbon fuel standard basically told me on the record, he's like, yeah, Tim had these numbers, and the numbers were right, and they were terrible, but they were politically untenable. So we basically had to come up with different numbers, because otherwise they would have gotten rid of the entire low carbon fuel standard. And he said that. And, you know, maybe he was right. Maybe they would have gotten rid of it. I think that would have been fine. But in any case, there's, you know, the politics depend on this uncertainty. And usually, like, the average reporter isn't going to take 5 years to sort out who's right. And I'm not, like, that's not to pat myself on the back. I'm the idiot who took 5 years. But just, you know, and as long as there's uncertainty, then, you know, in this case, there's like this massive, probably the most politically influential interest group on the planet against Tim. So, you know.
And now Steve.
Steve has joined the fight. So that now it's like, you know, like what, like when Thomas Jefferson dined alone kind of thing. But it's still, it's an uphill battle.
But I will say this, though. I mean, you don't even have to know the details to know if we are clearing an area the size of England every year. If there is no solution to climate change that avoids, without stopping that, and if someone proposes to use 40% of the world's cropland to provide 25% of aviation fuel, that those are incompatible. And the other thing is that when this all started, there weren't alternative solutions for transportation. This all started in like 2007, the low carbon fuel standard was really being formed then. Biofuel policies were being expanded then. There weren't electric cars. There wasn't cheap solar. The number was given of that you get 100 times more usable energy, even on good agricultural land using PV. That translates into 300 times more miles per acre. But here's the thing. We don't need to use good agricultural land for PV. You can use deserts for PV, right? So the thing is that even though photosynthesis really stinks, blue-green algae really weren't that smart, there are all kinds of things that we can only do with photosynthesis. That includes forests. That includes eating. So we only have so much land that gets enough rainfall to do either of those well, and we should do those things with that land, and then you should get energy another way. So I think that now that there are such obvious alternatives to biofuels, the policy should get easier. And in fact, what's happened is it's now shifted basically to aviation and shipping.
So Tim, we have about 10 minutes, I think. There's a lot more in the book, and there's, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot more we could say. You might predict that. And, you know, some of the other things in the book are things about meat substitutes and different parts of agriculture. Also, big sections on other kinds of solutions that aren't biofuels, some of which have a similar hype cycle, as you say, some of which may be not right. But I don't think either of you are of the opinion that there's nothing that can be done, right? But maybe we should let the audience, if they want, pick out some of those topics or other ones or other kinds of questions that you might have. I've got a couple here, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, gentlemen. Also a journalist, and I'm curious about particularly like long-haul aviation, since that's, to my understanding, the one thing we can't currently decarbonize. What's your perspective on using biofuels in that as a bridge fuel?
You want to do it?
Maybe I'll go first, because again, when actually I did write a little bit. Tim and I went to Brazil back in 2008 when he first did his paper on biofuels. I remember I wrote a paper on a piece in Time magazine. It was on the cover of the Clean Energy Scam about how corn ethanol was essentially in the U.S. was leading to the destruction of the Amazon, and that it was terrible. And at the time, everybody was like, well, if biofuels are so bad, well, then what should we use instead? And I was like, gasoline. It's bad, but it's not as bad. And now, of course, we would say, electric vehicles. When it comes to sustainable aviation fuels, sustainable, the answer is, well, what should we use instead? And the answer is jet fuel, because biofuels are a frickin' disaster. And in fact, it's really interesting. The big beautiful bill that the Republicans just passed, although this was sort of the one bipartisan part of it, not only do they have big new subsidies for basically to put corn and soy into planes, since we don't want them as much into cars, but they had some very interesting language that was actually written by Amy Klobuchar's office that says, and when you decide whether these aviation fuels are in fact sustainable, you can no longer look at land use. You can't look at indirect land use change. Like, forget all that science. Tim's now published, 10 papers in Science and Nature? It's like, forget about all that, because obviously it's inconvenient and corn and soy won't pencil out. So it's like, put your pencils down.
But let me give you a very quick, can I just add another question? So the short answer is, particularly with the most obvious jet fuel, the emissions are going to be 3 times higher using biodiesel, the equivalent of biodiesel, HEFA, than jet fuel. However, about half of the warming effect of aviation is contrails. Right now, there are apps that airlines can use 10 hours in advance to make slight adjustments to their flights that reduce contrail effects by 70%. The cost is trivial. So that's what they should do. And that actually would have a more potent effect in the next 30 years. And then what we should do with the airlines is they should be paying to decarbonize other things, basically. You say 70 or 70%? 70%. And so, we can do things. There are lots of things the airlines could do, and they should be paying to do other things. It's a longer story, but even synthetic fuels are so inefficient. You take a solar watt, you turn it eventually into a jet fuel, you lose half the energy. So until we have surplus solar watts, you don't want to have change the long haul.
Also, if I could just jump in one more thing, because we have talked, obviously my book's about the environmental effect of these things, and it's been implicit, but the idea, we're going to need 50% more calories by 2050. And the idea that we are taking food away from hungry people and putting it in our cars and our jets, when we have, better things to do, better ways to do that, is it's not just sort of environmentally distressing, but it's like super immoral, and it's really bad.
Just want to make sure we get more questions. Yeah.
Thank you for the really interesting conversation. In the past few years, there's been an upswell in interest in things like biochar and other interventions and innovations within the agricultural system to improve soil health, improve yields, stuff like that. To what extent do you think that innovation within the agricultural system can help us get out of the problems that you've identified?
Can we take a couple of questions?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good.
I think we've just,
Oh.
we got 5 minutes. Lightning round.
Thanks. I'm a sociology professor at Yale, and The question that I have is about sort of your comment about how it takes a lot of work to dig into the models to figure out exactly where this went wrong, and then paired with this comment about people not even putting assumptions into the model that they think aren't politically palatable. So I'm really interested in sort of the process of knowledge making and how, if there's any way that we could sort of think about how climate scientists, economists, social scientists can be more transparent about the assumptions they're making so that we have all of the options on the table and you don't have academics preemptively removing possibilities because of what they think political ramifications might be.
Shall I do the first? You do the
Go ahead,
second?
yeah.
So I'm like very excited about all kinds of agricultural innovations. Maybe less some of the ones you mentioned, but I write in the book about, they're like alternative pesticides where they're using the mRNA technology behind the COVID vaccines to constipate potato beetles to death. Alternative fertilizers where they're gene editing microbes to snatch nitrogen out of the air and feed it to crops so that you don't have to bomb the fields with chemicals. And then I write about this sort of miracle tree called Pangamia that's like vertical soybeans, but it's above ground, so it's storing a lot of carbon, and it doesn't, has 10 times the yield, and it doesn't need fertilizer, and it doesn't need water. There is a lot of exciting stuff. Unfortunately, and this also makes me and Tim was a pioneer in unpopularity, and now I'm inheriting some of it. But a lot of this, sort of soil health stuff is sort of in the service of low yield, organic, and regenerative agriculture, which, and the basic message of the book is that we need to make more food with less land. Well, if you're making less food per acre, and that's where a lot of the innovation is these days, you are going to need more acres to make food, and you are going to eat more of the earth. So, a lot of these focus on the microbiome and, we're using GMOs or, too many GMOs, too many pesticides, it's sort of ignored. The big problem is that agriculture is eating the earth, and the kind of like yield increasing crop and livestock technologies are very exciting. Some of the soil health stuff I fear is sort of pushing in the wrong direction.
Tim, yes or no, should economists be adjusting parameters to false values to make a politically acceptable answer?
Of course they should. I'll tell a funny story. So I'm a huge believer in transparency and simplicity, whatever possible, in those models that cannot be verified through experimental data. So in quantum mechanics, they can have a totally incomprehensible model with extraordinary complicated parameters because they can test it to like multiple decimal points and determine it's right, and nobody knows why it's right, but you can prove it. But if you can't do that, which is basically true in most of the many policy issues here, and including in economics, then you have to be going for simpler models where you can show things happening. So Steve and I spent a lot of time trying to develop models that are transparently, not just transparent, but intuitively understandable so you can follow the logic. And I will just say the one thing, that's an advertisement for the Tobin Center, right? I'll end with this. So I just to be clear, I'm a senior fellow of the Tobin Center, for which I get one frozen pizza every 2 or 3 years. So I'm clearly biased. But really, that's what it's about. And I've spent years basically nagging at Steve to say, hey, look, the really good economists need to do more to police the BS economics that goes on. And that's true not just in that field, but other fields. And I do think that's a real challenge for academia to actually have that kind of policing.
So we have 2 minutes. Can we have a lightning round with a couple more questions? We're not going to get to everybody, but some people had their hand up here earlier. I don't know.
This woman here.
Hi. So you have convinced me that using new land or clearing land in order to produce biofuels is a bad idea and that we should put some solar panels on there instead. What about all of the agricultural waste and biofuel? Because that's not the only way to create biofuels. So for example, pig waste, cow waste, crops that sometimes are produced via subsidies and then sit in the field unused. So,
I think the short answer is that theoretically using waste for biofuels or pretty much bio anything is fine, but there isn't really that much of it. And the airline, like United has an ad with Oscar the Grouch bragging about their how they're turning waste into jet fuel, but that's not really United's plan. They want to use corn and soy for jet fuel. If a little bit of waste, that's fine, but that's not really the play.
So we get one last question? Yeah, one last, or two? Yeah,
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Janine Salendi. You mentioned a lot about oceans. I'd like to jump us back to the oceans and ask you how much kelp farming, for example, underway right now in Norway, and they're experimenting what can be done. Seagrass around the world is being encouraged because of how much carbon dioxide it absorbs. How much could that be used in the biofuel?
Great. Why don't we collect one more? Yeah.
Carbon capture and storage, yay or nay?
So, quick answer on the kelp issue is 0 for biofuels for the following reason: that if you manage to make more kelp, it is far more valuable to be used in almost any other way, particularly as an animal feed, if you could do that. It's just burning stuff is an inefficient way of using stuff. Carbon capture and storage, well, and seagrasses too. So, I mean, there's some capacity to probably do some more in kind of nearshore waters and with kelp, but limited.
What is it? It's growing plants good, burning plants bad.
Exactly. That's why I have a position at Princeton. Yes. And the short answer with carbon capture and storage is there's all kinds of things where it's probably useful. We can't, like for cement and things like that, we're going to want to do it. Adding that to bioenergy does not make it better. And here's a bizarre thing. Again, you have to be really brilliant to know this. If you take 1 ton of carbon out of a flue gas and you put it underground, that's worth 1 ton. It doesn't matter what you apply it to. So if bioenergy is worse than fossil fuels, then applying that to bioenergy is still worse than fossil fuels. It's just 1 ton equals 1 ton. And somehow or other, that has literally escaped people's attention, that it doesn't change the calculation. 1 ton equals 1 ton.
Great. On that profound observation, we've had a lot of them. Thank you so much for coming. I will say I have not been a previous Climate Week participant, and we weren't quite sure if anyone would be here. So we're really happy to see you. They were great questions. Probably will be around someplace if people still have questions.